The primary material used by most performance and body artists is their own bodies. As bodies cannot be exhibited except during the duration of the performance, the only way to study performance and body art is through photographs and the artifactual evidence, the props of the performances. This sounds obvious, but it touches on an important turn that much art took in the later 1960s. This was an indexical turn, where rather than depicting or expressing something, as the art historian Rosalind Krauss has observed, artists instead simply produced and recorded evidence. An index is a kind of sign that relates to its referent immediately, directly, like a weather vane that shows the direction of the wind, or a footprint in the sand, or a blueprint of a body, as Rauschenberg made in the late 1940s. Long before Rauschenberg, the earliest precedent for performance art may well be the performances of Zurich Dada. And today, what do we have of Hugo Ball's performances but his poetry, the script, and the photo of him as a magical bishop? More immediately, Alan Capro's happenings and the actions of Fluxus artists like Joseph Beuys and Yoko Ono set the stage for performance art. Another precedent came in Austria in the form of the Viennese actionists. These artists were notorious for their production of a kind of theater that, like Capro's, picked up on Antonin Artaud's surrealist idea of the theater of cruelty, a kind of theater meant to jolt an audience into an authentic response. Instead of focusing on text, on a script, the Viennese actionists produced violent ritual performances, which, at some time or other, landed most of them in jail. Some commentators have suggested that they did it to unblock repressed emotions about Austria's violent and enthusiastic Nazi past. From my own experience of Austria, I would say that they failed in unblocking anything, but that's another story. Hermann Nietzsche ritually slaughtered animals on stage. Here you see a performance of his Theater of Orgies and Mysteries from 1984. After ritually slaughtering a bull at Nietzsche's castle at Priesendorf and evoking the animal's sacrifice with a bloody, empathic crucifixion, the performers and the audience cooked and ate the animal. In this sense, Nietzsche also aimed, a little like Arte Povera, but a lot more viscerally, to reconnect culture with nature, to show where meat comes from, and to give that animal that provides the meat a ceremonial and dignified death. In England, Gilbert and George, a dynamic art duo that formed in 1967, made their own bodies the material of what they called living sculpture. The most famous living sculpture they made, in various versions, is their singing sculpture, originally from 1969. The piece consists of Gilbert and George singing along with an old popular vaudeville-type song about tramps called Underneath the Arches. They regarded the suits they wore as uniforms, and they covered their faces in gold paint, rather like Joseph Beuys, but without any of the shamanism. Far from it, the paint made their bodies into machines whose every move and sound were predetermined by the popular culture song they acted to. It was a new twist on the idea of the artist as empty vessel, the artist as funnel for cultural materials he or she did not create. Generally speaking, American performance and body artists were not political, at least not overtly. Instead, they used their bodies to stage often masochistic ordeals. Perhaps you could say that they mapped the brutality of the body politic and of the social body onto their own bodies. Perhaps by doing this, they demonstrated how tough they were, able to endure anything that our savage and murderous culture could throw at them. The most notorious of these artists was Chris Burden. His 1971 performance, called Shoot, involved a marksman shooting Burden at close range in the arm, an event recorded on video. Some writers at the time regarded the piece as a comment on the brutality of Vietnam. As we know, the brutality was in the media, with images from My Lai, and other ones too. like this famous photo from 1968 of the execution of a Viet Cong prisoner, showing the moment the bullet enters his skull. Like Shoot, Burden's piece called Transfixed from 1974 also involved self-mutilation. Assistants crucified Burden on a Volkswagen Beetle that was backed out of a garage onto a driveway for 2 minutes, then pulled it back inside, all as the motor revved. In addition to photos of these famous pieces, certain props survive: the bullet, the nails. Burden treats them the way someone might regard religious relics. The Yugoslavian-born performance artist Marina Abramović also pioneered art that involved self-mutilation. Her first performance, Rhythm 10, from 1973, involved playing a knife game called Five Finger Fillet. Starting with the first of 20 knives, she placed her hand palm down and quickly stabbed the knife in one after the other of the spaces between her fingers. Each time she cut herself, she retired a knife. At the 20th cut, she replayed an audio tape of her just-finished performance and did it one more time in sync with the sounds of the recording. Her 1974 piece, called Rhythm 0, explored her capacities of endurance and vulnerability in relation to her audience, and in this sense it recalls Ono's Cut piece. With 72 objects at their disposal to inflict either pain or pleasure on her body, objects that included a loaded gun, she endured the increasingly threatening interventions of members of the audience during the 6-hour performance. In testing and demonstrating the capacities of an artist to endure pain and danger, these pieces may well be the first impulses toward the craze for body piercing that began a few years later in the punk scene. Some have suggested that, long before piercings became simply fashionable, they originally registered the toughness of a person in a tough world. Back in the USA, Vito Acconci used his performances to investigate themes of submission and domination. The following piece, from 1969, involved his shadowing a stranger for as long as that person remained in the public sphere. If the person he followed went into a movie theater, so did he. If the person entered the subway, so did he. The piece usually ended only when the person got home. In this way, Acconci performed the ultimate submission. His every move was determined by the person he followed. But at the same time, of course, that person could feel menaced and uncomfortable. Here is Acconci's 1972 piece called Seedbed, comprised of a ramp and a speaker in an otherwise empty gallery. Inside the ramp lay Acconci, who would masturbate when he heard a visitor's footsteps overhead. His moans and groans would be amplified by a speaker into the audience's space.